The New South Wales government has finally released its first details of the gun buyback, and, well, there's two words in that announcement that I really think needs to be challenged: fair compensation. Because once you look at what they're actually offering, I don't know how anybody involved in shooting is supposed to take these words seriously. And before I get into it, I know that I've been away from the channel for quite a while, and it's generally great to be back. And thank you everybody who has sent me messages and continued to watch my videos. So I really, really do appreciate that. And, there's been more to say about where the channel is heading later. But honestly, today I want to stay focused on the buyback, because there are plenty here that I believe that really does need to be spoken about. And look, the first thing is the money. Under Phase 1, the New South Wales government is introducing a fixed price schedule. Depending on the firearm, you're looking at payments between $450 and $1,000. That's it. A centerfire rifle, $1,000. A rimfire, $600. An air rifle, $450. And apparently, that's fair compensation. Come on. Seriously, come on. Anybody who actually owns firearms knows how ridiculous it is to value them purely by category. A centerfire isn't just simply worth $1,000 because the government has written centerfire rifle on the spreadsheet. And you could have two centerfire rifles sitting next to each other, and their value could be thousands and thousands of dollars apart. And you could even have an entry-level hunting rifle and entry-level hunting rifle at one end, and a high-quality target or competition rifle at the end. Different manufacturer, different model, different action, different barrels, different specifications, different conditions as well, and completely different market value. And yet, under this system, the starting point is effectively, it's a centerfire. Well, here's $1,000 on your bike. See you later. And that's where I call the nonsense. Because if the government wants to describe this as a compensation, fine, it's compensation. But don't automatically call it fair. Fair compensation. And when the amount is being offered can be nowhere near the actual value of the property that's being surrendered. And before someone says that I'm, claiming every firearm is worth $1,000 or $10,000, I'm not at all. There are plenty of firearms worth less than these amounts, and there'll be probably some that will actually do reasonably well out of the fixed price schedule. That's not the issue. The issue is pretending that one fixed number can fairly represent the entire category of firearms. It simply can't. And the government effectively admits that itself, because Phase 2 specifically being created for eligible high-value firearms with an indicative market value of above $3,000. Market value above $3,000. So apparently market value does matter. Apparently the government understands that firearms within the same broad categories can have dramatically different values. And apparently they understand that some firearms are worth thousands of dollars. But then why does that principle suddenly kick in at $3,000? What about somebody with a rifle worth $2,800? What about $2,500? What about $2,000? If the government's fixed payment is $1,000, is the owner just expected to wear the difference? That's the hypocrisy about this offer, and it's really, really irking me. On the other hand, the government recognises that market value when it suits the structure of the scheme. On the other hand, they're using broad fixed prices and calling them fair. And you can't have it both ways. And remember how we got here. Those reforms followed by the horrific terrorist attack at Bondi Beach in 2025. And what happened was disgusting. Absolutely. Nobody should minimise that. People who commit terrorist acts or violent crimes should face the full consequences of what they've done. But the people being affected by these ownership limits weren't involved in that attack. The overwhelming majority of licensed firearm owners weren't involved in any crime at all. None of us ever have. They went through the licensing processes, they registered the firearms, and they compiled. We go so hard to comply with storage requirements. We pay our fees. We follow the law. And yet we are the people having limits placed on what we can own. There are people potentially having to surrender their property as well, and there are people being financially affected. That's where I think we also need to talk about the principle of collective punishment. That's a very important thing. Collective punishment. I'm not using that as some sort of technical legal argument. I'm talking about it in honestly plain Aussie English. When one person or a tiny number of people does something horrific and the response is to place additional restrictions on the entire group of people who didn't do it, what are people supposed to call that? You committed an offence. You weren't involved, you followed every rule, but because somebody else committed an appalling act, the ruling governing your property change. And once again, licensed firearm owners are the easiest people to go after because the government knows exactly who they are. Your license is on the system, your firearm is registered, your address is known, your details are easy accessible by the government. And if the government changes the rules tomorrow, you're easy to find and easy to regulate. But the bloke with an illegal firearm who doesn't give a damn about the firearm laws, do you really think that he's sitting at home worrying about whether he's exceeded the new legal ownership limit? Of course he isn't. That's the part that really does frustrate every single law-abiding person. Politicians continually tell us that these laws are about public safety and criminal misuse. But the practical restrictions keep landing on people already complying. And those people are treated like they're unreasonable for asking questions. They're not unreasonable questions. If the problem is a criminal misuse of firearms, show me how forcing the compliant licensed shooter to surrender a legally owned competition rifle solves that problem. Show me that connection. If the person has passed all the checks and maintained their license, complied with the storage laws, and has no history suggesting they are a danger to the public, are we really addressing safety by telling them now only one firearm too many? That's the conversation that I want to see. Not another waste of time press conference, not another politician standing behind a microphone telling everybody that they've induced some of the toughest new laws of the generation. Explain the actual mechanism. Explain how this makes the community safer. Because saying a fewer guns equal safe isn't enough when people are talking about registered firearms held by licensed people who have committed no offence. I've never seen that discussion. And then we come back to compensation. Because even if you comply, support these laws, and surely there should be still a basic principle here. If the government changes the rules and requires someone to give up a legally acquired property, the government should compensate that person properly. The owner did not cause the law to change. The owner did not suddenly make their property illegal through their own actions. Government made that decision. So why should the individual take the financial loss? Imagine this in almost any other situation. Imagine the government telling tomorrow that you're no longer allowed to keep something you legally bought. Then they tell you that they're willing to pay. And you say, but that's worth twice that. And the answer is basically, that's the category price. People would lose their minds. But because we're talking about firearms, suddenly we're supposed to pretend that ordinary ideas about property and fairness doesn't apply. And I don't accept that. If a firearm generally has a market value of $900 and the government gives the owner $1,000, well, fair enough. But if the firearm has a genuine market value of $2,500 and the offer is $1,000, that owner has lost $1,500 because the government changed the rules. Call it whatever you like. That's a financial loss. And the individual hasn't done anything wrong to cause that. And that's why this isn't simply about whether you like firearms. You don't even need to be a shooter to understand that principle. It is so basic. The question is whether the government should be able to force change to somebody's legally owned property and when they decide for itself what represents fair value. And if there's anything else worth mentioning, the government says Phase 2 will provide a pathway for eligible higher value firearms, but there's going to be a fee attached to that process. Again, let's think about that. The government introduces a law. The government requires you to surrender the firearm. Your firearm is valuable enough that the basic government offer isn't suitable. And then you have to pay a fee to go through that process, demonstrating what your own property is worth. I want to see the full details before making too many claims about how that process will work. But on information that they've released so far, that's another part of the scheme that deserves a very close look. And I hope Shooters Union Australia, I hope SSAA, I hope any shooting representative is looking at this extremely close. And that's why I think shooters need to keep their argument grounded. We don't need to exaggerate. We don't need to pretend every rifle in a safe is worth 10 grand. Not at all. Some of them are not. We don't need conspiracy theories as well. Just look at the government's own numbers. They're offering a fixed payment as low as $450, and they acknowledge that high-value firearms exist, and they acknowledge firearms above 3 grand require a different process. And yet, they're still using language of fair compensation. So let's ask them to demonstrate that fairness. How did they determine these amounts? What evidence did they use, and what happens to a firearm worth substantially more than a fixed offer, but less than the 3 grand threshold? How will modifications or specialised competition firearms be treated? And what exactly is Phase 2 assessment fee going to be? And if somebody disagrees with the government's valuation, what is the appeals process they will have? Those are questions that need answers before anyone starts congratulating themselves on how fair the scheme is. Because at the end of the day, this comes down to something very, very simple. These people were doing the right thing. They bought their firearms legally. They licensed them, they registered them, and they stored them correctly. Then the government changed the rules. And now some people are being told to hand over their property on a compensation schedule. That deserves scrutiny. And when those restrictions are being justified in actions by criminals and terrorists who absolutely have nothing to do with the ordinary licensed shooter being affected, then yes, I think we should call out the hypocrisy. Stop telling law-abiding firearm owners they're not being targeted when they're the ones having their own ownership restricted. Stop telling people that market value doesn't matter when your own second phase specifically recognizes market value. And stop using words of fair compensation unless you're prepared to show that compensation is actually fair. That's the nonsense of this offer, and I think every single Australian, whether they own firearms or not, should be asking whether this is how they want governments to treat people who have followed the rules. Because, honestly, today it's firearms, tomorrow could be your ATVs. The bigger principle is what happens when the government changes the rules after you've done everything right. Let me know what you think below. I want to know your thoughts in the comments. Do you think that these figures are generally represent fair compensation? And if you're going to be affected by the buyback, without sharing any personal details, I'd like to know your personal opinion about what's going on as well. Because I think some real world examples might tell us a lot more about how fair this offer actually is. And of course, make sure you like and subscribe. It's great to be back. Thank you so much for everybody's support, and we'll see you in the next video.